Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're really excited to share this evening with you. This program is part of our fall series called CONVOCATION, CONSECRATION, which relates to our organization, HotHouse, endeavoring to purchase the Elliott Donnelly Center at 3947 South Michigan. And so ideally, we were going to have part of the program consecrating the site, but that didn't happen. So we're doing programs at different locations. And so our first program is here tonight. But the whole series reflects upon this the theme of Pan-Africanism and internationalism, and a time that was a very robust moment when there was kind of many liberation struggles throughout the South that were collaborating with one another, now known somewhat as the Global South. And culture was a key part of all of those struggles, including music, film, dance, poetry, literature. And so we wanted to revisit that very exciting moment, which really is why HotHouse was started, was to continue in that vein of really kind of promoting culture and using culture as a means for social justice organizing and community development. So this is a film that was from 1972. It's the official documentary, and we are very honored to have three panelists here who I think we couldn't ask for a better group of people to open the program discussing not only the film but also their work and touching on the moment that we're in and kind of what's happened in the last 50 years where this kind of golden moment of liberation and revolution and culture was really thriving in a very robust way, and people in the U.S. were spending a lot of time going to Africa and being inspired by not only the revolutions in Africa and anti-colonial movements, but also in the Caribbean and Cuba and elsewhere. So I don't want to speak too long. I want to turn over the conversation. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes before the movie starts. And we organized it in that order because the movie's 90 minutes. If we have time at the end of the screening, we'll hopefully discuss a little bit more after you've seen the film. So we want to welcome three really esteemed panelists. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Haki Madhubuti. He's a best-selling poet, author, publisher, and educator, and is widely regarded as one of the architects of the Black Arts Movement and is founder and publisher of Chicago's Third World Press. And he's just a true treasure to humanity. So please welcome Dr. Madhubuti. Dr. Alkalimat is an American professor of African American Studies and Library and Information Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of several books, including Introduction to Afro-American Studies, The African American Experience in Cyberspace, Malcolm X for Beginners, and The History of Black Studies. He curates two websites related to African American history, Malcolm X, a research site, and eBlack Studies. So that's just a very short part of his biography, so please give it up for Dr. Alkalimat. And finally, we are so fortunate to have our moderator and also an esteemed associate professor, Lynette Jackson, Dr. Lynette Jackson, professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Black Studies at UIC. She received her PhD in African History from Columbia University. She's the author of Surfacing Up, Psychiatry and Social Order in Colonial Zimbabwe, and numerous other articles and book chapters on topics relating to women, the state, and medical and public health discourses in colonial and post-colonial Africa. The Lost Boys and the Cuban 600 is a recent work that she's done looking at the southern Sudan and streams of unaccompanied children. She has also begun conducting research for a critical biography of Winnie Mandela. So we have really such a great group of people to talk. So I don't want to talk further. Please, after the show, we'd like to talk to you a little bit about our plans for HotHouse and the rest of our fall festival. All the programs are free, and they're free because we receive funding from the City of Chicago, Department of Cultural Affairs, Chicago Presents Grant, and we're grateful for their support. So without further ado, we'll talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll show the film. Thank you.
Well, I'll get things started. First of all, I'd like to thank Marguerite and Assad, the Logan Center, and of course the HotHouse organization. We're all looking forward to the HotHouse reestablishing itself and getting its physical space. And thank all of you guys for coming out this evening. So I'm the moderator. I'm going to just give a little bit of some introductory comments, really, and then ask questions and also just open up the floor to the panelists who are going to be giving their insights about the film, but also just, all of their experiences. So one thing I wanted to just talk a bit about is the genealogy of the Algiers Pan-African Cultural Festival of 1969, where thousands of musicians, dancers, artists, activists from various parts of both independent Africa and Africa, particularly Southern Africa and Lusophone African countries that were still struggling for their independence. But also folks from North Vietnam and Black America, particularly the Black Panther Party, were in attendance. While this was the first Pan-African cultural festival of its kind, there were many earlier gatherings that I just thought I would mention because I really see this as, part of that genealogy. First of all, the Pan-African Congresses from 1900 to 1945 were kind of, I would say, predecessors in that these were Pan-African gatherings focusing on bringing the sort of Black world, the African-descended world together, as well as fighting against racism and imperialism. But then something that came to mind when I thought about, well, what else would I sort of consider to be part of that genealogy? And what came to mind was the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955. And that conference was organized to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation and to oppose colonialism and neo-colonialism. So really to bring together what Vijay Prashad referred to as the Dark Nations in his book, The Dark Nations, a kind of people's history of the Third World. And then the All African People's Congresses, the first one in 1958 in Accra, organized by Kwame Nkrumah and George Padmore. And then others, 1960 in Tunis, 1961 in Cairo, focusing on winning independence and preventing neo-colonialism. And you'll see in the film that we're about to watch that struggle both against colonialism and imperialism, but also very much against neo-colonialism, which was already very much present at this point by 1969. And then another sort of conference that I would sort of fit into this genealogy is the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, Cuba in 1966. Which focused on countries in the throes of revolution, particularly Cuba and Vietnam, but also Guinea-Bissau and just a range of countries, which at this moment were engaging primarily in militant, sort of violent anti-colonial struggles. So that era of quote unquote peaceful transitions was over, and now you basically had the more intransigent colonial powers and the longer liberation struggles. So, and then the FESPACO, which was the first Pan-African Film Festival in Burkina Faso, and that was actually the same year, 1969. So as Marguerite said, this was a period with a lot of revolutionary energy, certainly anti-colonial and anti-imperialist energy, and in many ways it was sort of coming together and converging on Algiers. But another thing I wanted to just talk briefly about is why Algiers? And I mean, well, you know, somebody decided Algiers, but I mean, in terms of its sort of significance, Algiers, the Algerian Revolution from 58 to 1962, or was it even earlier than that? 54 to 1962, was a protracted, you know, anti-colonial struggle against the French, and particularly the sort of Vichy French. And it was fought using tactics of urban guerrilla warfare, and really in many ways sort of was characterizing this sort of new brand of anti-colonial liberation struggles. And according to Amilcar Cabral, and I have a quote from him which I think really expresses why Algiers, or responds to that question. According to Amilcar Cabral, who was the leader of the PAIGC, a movement against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, quote, "Pick up a pen and take note. The Muslims make the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Christians to the Vatican, and the national liberation movements to Algiers." So, you know, and that just sort of responds a bit to this why Algiers. And then finally, you know, another thing about Algiers, even though Frantz Fanon, who lived in Algiers, who relocated to Algiers, you know, was a Martinican psychiatrist, while he died in 1961, it seems to me that his ideas really infused the conference. The connection between political, cultural, and social liberation. The need for decolonization of the mind as well as culture, and the important role of culture in that process of decolonization. And then also just the unfinished African Revolution, particularly represented by the struggles in Southern and Lusophone Africa. So I think I'm gonna stop there, just a little bit of background. I know Haki and Abdul will add to that historical context. So my first question, and again, I want you guys to feel free to say whatever you want, right? These are just kind of guiding questions. What work what is the work of the festival? You know, that's a strangely phrased question. Well, I guess, yeah, but I do want to know, what work do you think the festival did or accomplished? And I'll just leave it that broadly. So who wants to start? I mean, you can talk about the goal, but also just in general, what?
Well, I can talk. I was there, and
Oh, I thought
I was there, and I guess what. Well, how did I get there, and why was I invited? I was 27 years old, and my third book, Don't Cry, Scream, had been published, and Ebony magazine did this major piece on me the same month that Don't Cry, Scream came out, and Don't Cry, Scream sold 75,000 copies. This was in March of 1969. And as a result of, I think, the success of this book and my positions, because at that time I believed in, and still do, believe in independent black institutions. and that we were in the early days of building Third World Press, which I gave most of you catalog. And if I didn't give you one, I'll give you one before you leave. Third World Press, which is 56 years old now. And we own a half a block on the south side of Chicago. And when I say we, I'm talking about my wife. She's back there, Dr. Carol D. Lee, who's one of the major scholars in the world. She's emeritus from Northwestern University, and she is she's the president of the National Academy of Education. So she's pretty tight. So in order to stay with her 50 years, I had to be tight also. And so the early days of trying to find out where my place was going to be in the struggle, and I've been in black struggle all my adult life. I came out of the military, forced out of the military in 1963, and of course went right into struggle. My mentors were Eldridge Cleaver, Malcolm X, Margaret and Charlie Burroughs, who, along with others, built the first black museum in the nation. And when I joined them in 1962, it was the Ebony Museum of Negro History. And of course, John H. Johnson threatened to sue them unless they changed their name, because he ran Ebony magazine. And that's how we got to DuSable Museum of African American History. But Margaret and Charlie Burroughs mentored me, as well as my first publisher from Broadside Press, which was Dudley Randall, and Broadside Press in Detroit, Michigan. And that's how I got the idea for Third World Press, along with volunteering at the museum in 1962. I was in the military at that time, going crazy. And I couldn't get a security clearance, so anyway, I'm not going to go through all that. But the point is that Eldridge Cleaver, Malcolm X, Margaret and Charlie Burroughs, Dudley Randall, and then a man who was responsible for a lot of activity in Chicago, Hort W. Fuller. He took me under his wings also. Hort Fuller, here I am in the early days. This is Festac here, okay? And so here's Hort, here I am. This is the great Val Gray Ward, and this is the great Jeff Donaldson, okay, artist. And so what was happening during that period, Margaret Burroughs and others prior to that had founded the Southside Community Arts Center. And in the Southside Community Arts Center, you had mainly the major black artists coming in and out. But it was a major center, which was across the street from the museum, right across the street, okay? And so I'm on the streets at that time, very poor. I found a Third World Press in my basement apartment at 62nd and Ada, about the size of these 4 seats that I lived in with other unwanted animals. And but the point is that I'm involved now in black struggle at the street level, at a very serious level. So Hort W. Fuller, and then after Hort W. Fuller was the great educator, Barbara Ann Sizemore. She took me and my wife. We weren't married at that time. She was chasing me, but we weren't married at that time. And got to get some levity in this stuff. And then after Barbara was the great Gwendolyn Brooks. And Gwendolyn Brooks took me under her wings, and almost the rest is history. She wrote the introduction to Don't Cry, Scream. And I began to teach at Columbia College in 1968. And then I went to teach at Cornell University. I was the first black poet in residence at Cornell University. So anyway, I'm trying to get to the point why I was invited. And I think that all that activity in Chicago, as well as knowing these people, recommending me, I got the invitation. So when I get to Algiers and I didn't have no money. The great brother who was the first director, and probably the only director in many cases, of the African Studies Department at Cornell University. What's his name? The first director? James Turner. James asked me to stay at Cornell, but Cornell was more racist than Chicago. Why would I stay there? So I left and came back to Chicago and began to work at UIC here in Chicago. But I can say it now. He said, Haki, don't ever tell anybody this. He gave me $500. All right. Gwendolyn Brooks gave me another $500. All right. Hort Fuller gave me some money too. So that's how I was able to get to Algiers, you know, with a knapsack, one pair of pants, about 2 shirts, and used underwear. Anyway, so we get there. I don't have my notes, but let me just say this. I met Nina Simone. I was in sessions with her and her crazy-ass husband, all right? And the great Archie Shepp. I mean, this brother was bad. I had already met Pharoah Sanders, so I'm Archie Shepp, but Pharoah wasn't there, but Archie Shepp. And then this great poet, Ted Jones. Ted Jones came out of lower New York, east side, you know, the kind of the beach stuff. But he left there and went to Africa to live in Africa. And then Ed Bullins, who became a great playwright. I do not remember who Baby D was. Okay, the artist who did this piece here was the great artist for the Black Panther paper. What was it? Emory Douglas, right? So all these are copies. They're in my home on the wall. So I had a professional photographer come in and shoot these for me so I can show them to you all. These are basically 2 of the ads, poster ads, that came out of the Algerian conference. So my involvement, for the most part, obviously we had a reading there. I went to most of I had met Eldridge Cleaver the year before, in 1968. Hort Fuller, who was the managing editor of Negro Digest, we had not changed Negro Digest to Black World yet. I led the struggle to change Negro Digest to Black World magazine. We set up a picket line outside Johnson Publishing Company before it moved to the big building. It was still at the South Side location. And we were able to change Negro Digest to Black World magazine. But the key point is he is underserved. Hort W. Fuller is one of the greatest men of our tradition. I mean, really great, okay? If you want to know about what happened during the Black Arts Movement, read Negro Digest Black World magazine until John H. Johnson got rid of him. And I know the story behind that, but I don't have time to tell that story. But the key point is, when I got there, I had the introduction to a lot of the people. And for me, coming back to the States, Ted Jones said, Haki, well, I was Don Lee at that time. He said, Don, look, you just can't get on the plane and go back to the States from Algiers. Let's go to Casablanca. I said, what are you talking about, man? He said, let's me and you leave Algiers after the conference and go to Casablanca. I said, well, how are we going to get there? He said, don't worry about that. I should have, all right? We walked, we took trains, we took buses, and everything else that was moving, camels, we took to Casablanca, all right? Going through fairs, all right? It was a great trip for me, all right? And I got a poem, if I have a little bit of time later on, I'll read the poem that I published in the book that I published after I came back from Algiers is this book here, We Walked the Way of the New World, all right? And the cover is by Omar Lima, the great Black arts poet. And I got a poem in here on Ted Jones. So I think that I was invited as a result of my connections at one point, because I had not really made a name other than the Ebony article and then that book. And finally, let me just end up saying that I think that Abdul may have an appreciation for this. This is my memoir, the first 21 years of my life. And in this memoir, by the time I was 18, I had read most of W.B. Du Bois and Richard Wright and others. And I was in basic training in 1960, reading Here I Stand by Paul Robeson. And the drill sergeant saw Paul Robeson's big, black, magnificent face on the book, and he snatched the book out of my hand and said, "What's your Negro mind doing reading that Black Communist?" All right. So I never heard of, the phrase like that so creatively, Black Communist, you know what I'm saying? So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I got this. The guy snatched the book out of my hand. All right, I'm 18 years old. He snatched the book out of my hand, and he barked in my face, and he held my book over his head, and he commenced to tear the pages out the book and gave a page to each recruit and said, "Use this for toilet paper." Now the question now is, what am I going to do? What can I do? I don't have family. I'm by myself. The only reason I'm in the military is because I'm poor and I'm black and I don't have no place else to go. All right? I'm on my own. I don't have any family. All right? So I take it. But I said then at that time, this is where I'm going to stand. One, I'm a man of African ancestry. I'm a black man in America, even though I'm this color. All right? And I would never apologize for that, ever. Number two, I understand the power of ideas, that ideas and the creators of ideas run the world, and we all tap dance to somebody's ideas. And my question was, even though I had read and read and read, I started reading at 14. I gave you a history of Haki Madhubuti, one page, at 14 years old with Black Boy. But the key point is, why do I have to join the Army? And when you read this book here, that's my mama, all right? She was dead at 34 years old. She worked in the sex trade. She had sold herself, and she went out, and she didn't come back, all right? So, but there's a page in here. You see Margaret Burroughs and Charlie Burroughs, but you see two men who I adopted as my grandfathers, Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois, okay? I adopted them. They don't know nothing about it, all right? So I'll just kind of end up there and let Abdul tell the story.
Okay, well, Abdul, I think I'll just give you the floor, but maybe talk a little bit about the role of culture and specifically in the sort of Pan-Africanist project.
Sure. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to share some ideas about what we're here to talk about. I think the critical, I see the world in terms of contradictions. And the important contradiction that this film represents is a contradiction between culture and politics. That really was driving not only what was happening on the continent, but what was also happening here. So there's kind of parallel developments. And I come to this, it's interesting, Haki talking about Margaret Burroughs in the DuSable Museum. When the DuSable Museum was founded in Margaret's living room, one of the few exhibits that was there at the initial opening was about my family. And my aunt Thelma was a very close friend of hers, not only at the DuSable Museum, but the Southside Community Arts Center as well. So I grew up in this environment as well. And so in terms of this contradiction that I talked about, Frantz Fanon had an interesting sort of stages of understanding the historical development of the struggle in Africa in 3 stages. The first stage was integration, the attempt to follow the demands, the standards of the colonial powers to integrate and to be successful under those terms. The second stage, after rejecting that, was nationalism, to wrap oneself in the national identity of your traditional culture. And the third stage, given the inadequacy of that, was revolutionary politics, to transform the society, to create new culture. And in a sense, the historical development, I agree very much with what Lynette said. I would add one thing to the origin, particularly at Bandung in 1955, and that is the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Because when the Chinese Revolution occurred in 1949, the entire world politics changed because there was a third world country that represented the possibility of a post-capitalist future. And so it was not only the Soviet Union, it was now China. And so when Zhou Enlai went to Bandung, that was very important because he was a symbol of what was possible in the third world. But also it's important to point out China and Bandung because the drama of the CIA begins to play out in relationship to the possibilities of revolution in the third world. So we get this, now the more specific genealogy of a cultural festival really begins with the French. Because the French assimilation policy was to transform intellectuals in their colonies into being French. And so they drew these people into Paris. And so Leopold Senghor, who becomes not only an important French intellectual, but also ends up being the president of Senegal. And so it was Senghor and people from the Caribbean, French colonies, that began to organize writers. So in 1955 and 1959 in Paris and Rome, they organized conferences in order to begin to talk about the need for there to be an independent literature, but still within this French model. And so when Senghor is elected president of Senegal, he then organizes a conference to move this intellectual, cultural development to Africa. And so that's the conference that takes place in Senegal in 1966. Now that's a very interesting meeting because the African-American delegation that comes are the established people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, et cetera, all of whom were financed by the US State Department. And an organization of African-American intellectuals, AMSAC, the American Society of African Culture, with leadership like Horace Mann Bond, Julian Bond's father, their plane that they had that came to that conference was financed by the CIA. So, you know, we get this involvement of the US government in trying to manipulate this cultural development. So that was and they call themselves the first festival. Well, in Algiers, would you note that they call themselves the first? And it was a direct response to what Senghor had done. And there were two, they say they were the first Pan-African festival. And by that, what they meant was they included North Africa. Senghor had excluded North Africa. And they also included the national liberation organizations that had been excluded by Senghor. So, but of course the CIA was there in 69. But there are other contradictions that are very interesting. For example, most African Americans think about Algiers as the Battle of Algiers, that very famous movie. And so, you know, that was heroic. Well, when the festival takes place, Boumediene has arrested Ben Bella and put him in jail. So there are these contradictions within the revolutionary process of Algeria. But what you have to understand is, what was the meaning of a cultural festival in Africa for African Americans? I mean, this was a psychological and emotional and dramatic experience to be part of something that had been denied, that had been broken, this link. You know, in other words, we're still dealing with the legacy of Tarzan, okay? And all the rest of those movies that, so there's, you know, independent of the politics, there was this great psychological and emotional connection. And yet at the same time, these contradictions emerged. Now there are two summations of the Algiers Festival that were published afterwards. Nathan Hare published a summation in the Black Scholar, and Hoyt Fuller, published a summation in Negro Digest. Very different summations. Hoyt's was basically his personal experience, not much discussion of the politics, not much discussion of the historical development, though Hoyt had been to the '66 meeting and had been one of the early expatriates in Africa, and Haki published a book with his summation of his experiences and so on. Yeah. So anyway, the contradictions in '69 involved many different things. For example, in all of these conferences, there was a contradiction between traditional culture, that is to say, the long memory of rural village people in their cultural manifestations in Africa, versus the urban insurrectionary cultural reflections. So when you look at this film, you'll see a lot of people standing on the street watching. These are Algerians who have come through colonialism, and it's a modern city, more or less, and they're dressed like people in the urban areas of the world, whereas they're looking at people coming from various African countries doing their traditional, so there's a contradiction there. Even a contradiction within Algeria. You don't see people, as Hoyt points out in his summation, in traditional dress. They're in Western clothes. So there's this generational dynamic that's going on. The central political issue is on the concept of negritude. This was the idea that cultural nationalism, that's what we called it in the United States, but that was Senghor's point of view. And this conference was a direct attack on negritude. So one of the speakers you'll see just a clip of in the film is Stanislav Adoteve, who is Minister of Youth and Culture from Dahomey. His basic idea is negritude is dead. For example, Senghor said, the Europeans are rational, Africans are emotional. And so this idea was, wait a minute, if we're going to have a revolution in Africa, it's going to be about industrialization. You know, you remember, what is it that Lenin said? Communism is electrification. Electricity is the basis of an industrial development. And so people like Nkrumah, when he created the Akasambo Dam to create electricity for all of West Africa, that was the way in which there was an alternative to what Senghor was talking about. So anyway, the point is that the manifestation of African Americans is also important. Remember, '66, Duke Ellington, the elites of African American culture. In Algiers, the only official delegation was the Black Panther Party. There were a lot of other people there, but the delegation that was official in the conference was the Black Panther Party. So they were given an office. You'll see that in the film. They were given a storefront, and they had exhibits, et cetera. The other thing I would mention is that in its relationship to the United States is we went through something similar. That is to say, in Algiers, there was a struggle between Marxism and negritude. In the United States, we went through a similar struggle in the African Liberation Support Committee and the movements generally in this struggle. What is interesting is that both in Africa and here, we now can look back on those struggles because we went through them and they're over, at least those generational issues, et cetera. What we can see is that there's a legacy of the cultural importance that came through all of those conferences, and there's a legacy of revolutionary politics that also comes through that whole experience. The same thing is true here in this country. That is to say, the cultural development is absolutely necessary, and we now face a new generation of hip-hop and other things, but the dangers remain. So that mainstreaming, so that the FBI and the CIA If you take, for example, Black Lives Matter, now this is such a difference between what we did, because what we did, we didn't have a lot of money. And what was interesting about what Haki was talking about in terms of Hoyt and Gwen Brooks, et cetera, is the attempt to get people jobs to become artists in residence, et cetera. I mean, that was really a breakthrough. Today, we're talking millions of dollars going to Black Lives Matter. So there's this co-optation and this attempt to stop the autonomous initiative of revolutionary politics and thinking at a time of rising fascism in this country. And so what's really interesting today is, do we have the possibility of cultural development that confronts this rising fascism, that moves us not only from the standpoint of Black identity, but the standpoint of human survival, the standpoint of democracy, the standpoint of the possibility of a future in this country. In 1967, when Obasi created the Wall of Respect, what happened is that it was Black power as politics that brought the artists together. I mean, otherwise it was like herding cats. But it was the politics that brought that together. And as you could see from the wall, there were various aesthetics, the various approaches, et cetera. But it was the unity that occurred. And it was simultaneous. This was a Wall of Respect, simultaneous with Aretha singing Respect. I mean, there was a moment. And so we look forward to the next moment when we can have that level of unity within which there would be a great deal of diversity. Even from 66 in Dakar to 69 in Algiers, the exhibits were almost the same. They were showing the same sculpture, the same pictures. Many of the same cultural groups were there. So that just proves the point, you know, that culture is so powerful and important. There's so much more to say.
Thank you. Marguerite, should we wrap it up since we have a 90-minute film?
You could talk for 8 more minutes, and then we're going to clear this.
How many more minutes?
8 more minutes.
Okay, let me take these 8 minutes. I need to respond to a couple of things.
Okay, let me just say one thing, though, just relating
Okay.
a bit to what Abdul was saying, because I think the question that came to my mind as I was listening to you is, this 1969 was a real reflection of a kind of internationalism. And I guess my question is that only possible within the context of the Cold War? Because you're sort of making these comparisons to today. And, you know, these sort of global struggle against fascism and the rise of fascism. And unlike during the sort of unifying anti-colonial moments, but also, you know, just the time of the Cold War, where there was just a very clear force, you know. There doesn't seem to be that sort of sight for unity in the same way.
Well, one of the important issues is that historically, whether it was the Soviet Union, whether it was China, whether it's Cuba, there was a country that sort of represented the possibility of a future. And people were learning from it and emulating it and following it and reading all about it, et cetera. That doesn't exist today. We're on our own, everybody.
We've always been on our own.
Yeah, well, that is also true. But what we have today, which is global, is this climate crisis. One of the greatest important aspects of the climate crisis is how it attacks African Americans, Latinos, poor people generally. But not only that, it's a global issue. And so what we're really talking about here is, in the 21st century, we have the challenge to discover what it means to be human in relationship to the transformation of the natural environment that all humans are a part of, in fact, all living things are a part of. That's the new challenge for the international development. And one of the interesting things about it is that the world's population lives near the sea, the whole world. And so in the next 50 years, when the sea rises, and it's already starting now, the climate migrations are going on. So the rise of fascism is directly connected to third world peoples moving in to the country. And so white people are no longer going to have their privileges as they've had in the past. And so you get this rise of racism out of the scaredness of people. And so we have to really rethink a lot of things. And black people, as we've always done, have to become the beginning of the transformation of the entire society.
You see, white supremacy is not new. It's been with us for centuries. And only within the last, say, 25, 30 so years, most certainly over the last 10 years, has it even been spoken of as being a real problem in the world, but most certainly right here in this country here. And what we knew, I and the people I've worked with all my life, is that white supremacy has always been the foot on the back of our necks. And that, yes, there are good white people in the world. That is never a question. The problem is there's not enough of them in positions of power and influence. That in many cases we have, and one of the reasons that we move toward developing independent black institutions, because we have to teach our babies from the beginning to love themselves. Because they come up within this culture hating themselves. That's why, see, we all do what we have been taught to do. And so how do we begin to move and navigate a culture, a civilization here that hates us? They don't just dislike us. You see what's happening in Florida. You see what happens in all the red states. This has nothing to do with economics. It has everything to do with economics, and we are the problem. All right? And so for me and for the people I work with all my life, is that it's critical that we have first entry into loving and teaching our children. All right? Because nobody's going to teach them and love them like we do. And that's why we put all this money and all of our efforts into building these schools on the south side of Chicago, which are over 50 years old and are still here. And therefore, you look at the brothers and sisters who are now doctors, who are now archaeologists, who are now anthropologists, who are now basically working in the field, but understanding first and foremost that they got to represent themselves. All right? Which does not at any level negate anybody else. All right? There's so much I wanted to respond to, but we had only 8 minutes. Can I read a poem? Let me read this poem I did for Ted Jones. And Ted Jones was one of the major artists to come out of the 50s into the 60s. And this was in my 4th book. And my first 4 books sold over 140,000 copies. But you would never know that unless you're in the black community. All right? And this poem is called Knocking Donkey Fleas Off a Poet from the South Side of Chicago for Brother Ted Jones. A world man with the careful eye, the deep look, the newest look, as recent and hip as the uncola being sipped by a Thelonious Monk, jacking it down little Rudy Tooties. He's a continent jumper, a show upper, a neo-bebopper. He's the first you see, the last to flee, the homeboy in African land, with an inner compass of the right way. At times, he's overlooked like a rhinoceros in a bird bath. The sound of his trumpet is a true off minor. To hear him tell it, bird is alive, blacks must colonialize Europe, jazz is a woman, and I did, I was, I am, and I believe him. He's younger than his poems and old as his clothes. He's better than bad, him so bad he could take a banana from a gorilla, pull a pork chop out of a lion's buttocks, or debate the horrors of war with Spiro Agnew with his mouth closed. A world man, a man of his world. Ted Jones is the tan of the sun's tan, a violent peace, looking for a peace, he'll find it in the only place he hasn't been, among the stars. That star, the one that's missing, last seen walking slowly across Africa, bringing the rest of the world with it. I want to thank you for allowing me to interact with you. I didn't see the film. I couldn't comment on the film because I haven't seen it. I wish I had, but I'll see it now. Thank you very much.
I was going to say
thank you,
that-
everyone. And
Thank you. It just got sort of started as usual when you have so many brilliant people that have so much to share with us. And, you know, for me, it's like after 4 years of listening to nonstop about the trial and all the indictments and all that air that it took up when we could be talking about and hearing from really brilliant people instead makes you kind of want to holler, right? I mean, it's just like, this is such incredible wisdom. And all I want to say is that, you know, HotHouse it's our 36th year. And the reason we got started and the reason we keep doing programming is because we really want to take what sometimes often exists in the academy, and we have 3 PhDs here, in that realm and bring it to in the popular realm so that we can all participate in this incredible knowledge and share and build community and build resistance and build knowledge and keep going. You know, that's the whole point. Keep going, keep going. So the movie is 90 minutes, which is an hour and a half. That leaves us another half hour if people want to stay, and the people who are here, I'm respecting their elder status, but if they feel like staying and talking some more, we could do that till 10 o'clock is when they kick us out. So anyway, I just wanted to say one more point. You know, one of the things that HotHouse is very interested in and is apropos of this conversation is looking at when the Transcontinental Conference took place in 1966 in Havana, Cuba, and Amilcar Cabral came to speak, and that it was at that conference that Fidel Castro heard the speech of Amilcar and was inspired to then go to Africa with military, technical, and other kinds of aid that eventually led to that battle in Quito Carnival that ended the apartheid regime of Southern Africa, more or less. So anyway, we're very invested in Cuba with HotHouse. We take many delegations there, and we still find it an inspiration. So I just wanted to say that. And anyway, I want to thank Sarah Baker and Assad Joffrey, who are helping with the whole series. We really hope you'll come to all our programs because it is also kind of globally looking at culture and social movements. And so we're going to start the movie shortly. We hope you'll stick around. I also want to acknowledge Floyd Webb, who's here with us in the audience, who's a filmmaker and also could be on this stage talking volumes about his time in Africa and culture. So with that, we'll turn the lights down, we'll take the stage off, we'll come back and talk a little bit after the movie for whoever's still here. We want to thank the Logan Center, and we also want to thank the City of Chicago for giving us money so that we can make these programs free. And we also want to tell you that on CAN TV, 2 more things. We're filming the discussion, which will be on YouTube on the HotHouse Global channel. So if people weren't able to come and they want to hear what was said, that'll be public for free. And then we also have a companion series that's part of our festival on CAN TV, starting on September 9th. And it's showing the film Festac, which Dr. Madhubuti referred to in this photograph, as well as a lot of other programs from Brazil and Guatemala, other documentary and feature films. So those are all free, Channel 21, Saturdays at 8 o'clock. So with that, the movie we're showing, the Pan-African Festival of Algiers from 1969, is the official documentary of the festival by William Klein, and it's 90 minutes. So thank you, and we'll be back after the show.
there is a rush, a fight to control those resources. And of course, as you know, oil is one of the major ones, but now you look at all the other resources that are required in order to even run electric cars or keep these damn phones going. So I think we're still in trouble, serious trouble. And the people of African ancestry do not control their own, on the continent or even here, destiny at this point.
I think you have to look at the world situation in stages. And it's possible to look at the end of a stage and be disoriented and be depressed and see things negatively. For example, the national liberation struggles made great advances and eliminated the overt colonial domination. Clear. However, what we thought was going to happen, that is some notion of freedom, take South Africa for example, we thought the ANC would represent the goals of, for example, transferring land to the people to create a new society. That didn't happen. Didn't happen in Zimbabwe. It didn't happen in any of these countries where, say, governments, presidents existed for many decades. So that was a democracy in the sense of the mobilization of people, raising the cultural level of the population, particularly the working class and the peasantry. That didn't happen. However, the world is entering a whole new stage if we look at it objectively. Because objectively what has happened is that in the 20th century, socialism and capitalism were both about industrialization. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. It was about industrialization. Why is that? Because that was expanding the economy and raising the quality of life for everybody. And the whole question of this conference, this festival, was why can't Africa make the same move and not simply be stuck in this negritude thing? Okay. But what is happening today is that a new economic development is transforming all of the global economies, the new technologies, the new algorithms that are dominating the reorganization of every economy in the world. But also, there's a multipolar development in the world. The BRIC countries, led by China, that creates an alternative to the dollar. So there's a whole new world that's emerging and developing. Even in South Africa, there is a new class struggle developing. There are new organizations of industrial workers, the new homeless, the shack dwellers, they call themselves. There's a new class struggle emerging. And so I think that it's possible for us to begin to think in new ways about the future, not just in one country, but on a global level. The same thing is true in this country, which never has been unionized. But there's a strike wave developing in this country right now. The Amazon workers, there's a lot of new developments that are happening. So I think we need to look first at the objective development of how things are changing, and then look for those glimpses of resistance that are coming. Remember, in the 50s, we didn't see the 60s. The mistake we made in the 60s is we thought we were normal. These were normal conditions. But we're now the elders, trying to look at this new generation, and we see them being sucked into the NGO money, these illusionary young people being told that they're the organizers and they haven't done shit. So we have really an interesting moment here that I'm trying to be as optimistic as possible, including about the continent, including about the Caribbean, and including about Chicago, because these kids that are, the gangsterism that's developing, those are our warriors that need to come to some political understanding that the future of Chicago is not out of the mayor's office. The mayor's office is to facilitate a more open environment, but we must self-organize. People must learn from the Harold Washington experience that will come and go. And unfortunately, people are thinking that we've now reached a new revolutionary stage of development in Chicago. That's an illusion. It's the quality of life of the people. How educated are people? What is the cultural development of people? What is the self-organization of people? When the March on Washington occurred, people thought people were going to go to Washington and the robbers were going to steal everybody's stuff. It turned out that was the day of the most decline of crime, because the political consciousness of people had swept through the community. So that's what we all need to be thinking about, something positive and not negative.
I don't want to seem to be positive. I just want to be seen realistic. Let me just one minute. I'm a realistic optimist. At the same time, we run free schools. We educate over 700 children a day. You cannot be more positive than that. Building independent Black institutions. I think the key point is that we have to understand that essentially, realistically, the same people, this country has over 800 billionaires now. Billionaires. That's the transformation from Reagan up to the present. You see, that's what we are. Money still running this thing, and white people around this money. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm a little younger than these gentlemen, so my sort of coming of age in Africa was more in the 80s, and sort of being a part of those moments in Zimbabwe, in South Africa in particular, and in Namibia, of independence, but they were really moments. You know, they're these post-colonial moments, and then, you know, there's always a question of what happens next, and often there's a detour, things get sidetracked, the Cold War ends, and all of a sudden, you know, things start to fall apart. There are all of these voids, failed states, etc. But I guess for me, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said, but I think also there's a void in sort of ideas. And so this visionary pragmatism, this way of thinking otherwise, but in a way that's alert and aware of the sort of problems of now. And I don't really have an answer, but I sort of feel like witnessing those moments when everyone was really buoyed, and not just people dancing in the streets, even though that to me has value as well, but you know, really thinking about alternatives, and really there was a certain freedom, even in a place like Zimbabwe. The first 10 years, I mean, even though there were serious problems from the beginning, don't get me wrong, but you know, there were development plans, there were cooperative movements. I mean, there were a lot of different things, of women ex-combatants, and this is gonna sound like a strange thing to bring up, but would just have children and not get married, and part of that was because they were opting out of patriarchy, but the point was, people were making those kinds of choices. And I think, I don't really know how you extend those moments and prevent those sort of voids where, you know, opportunists start to fill in. And, you know, you were talking about the NGOization of Africa, so a lot of people who would be activists are now in NGOs, you know, and sort of following the donor dollars. So I don't know if this is optimism, but I know that it's possible, you know, for those moments. And just like in the United States, we're kind of relying now, you know, we're not gone yet, but still the young people, you know, to really sort of hopefully, you know, make the change that we need at this moment. And I sort of feel like that's happening in certain places on the continent of Africa. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Comment about the film. You had a section on liberation movements, but from someone living in the United States and having experienced the 60s and whatever, there was no real mention of the liberation movement going on in the United States. Mm-hmm. They had snaps of Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was a major figure in the 60s. He'd written a book in 1966 entitled Black Power. And, you know, the Black liberation movement was raging in this country. So my question is, why wasn't there a section in the festival dedicated to what was happening here in the United States? Because Stokely and, you know, there's no mention of Panthers or you know, just in terms of what, you know, the rebellions that were going on, the cities that were burning. Detroit, Newark, Watts, maybe 100 other cities. All of that was happening. And so I just didn't, you know, I got the piece about Frelimo and the other people, and a lot of the people who were involved in the film were very political, Amilcar, Cabral, and others. So I'm just, I just
Take your point. What the Algerians did was establish for the Black Panther Party essentially an embassy and an acknowledgement of their representation of the struggle in this country as a legitimate global possibility for them to represent. They had a storefront and an exhibit of Emory Douglas's painting and their material, and they had panels. As Hoyt points out, and I think Nathan Hare points out in their articles, the Panthers did not participate in the symposium of the festival, but they had their own panels. And by the way, the person who spoke, Stanislav Adoteve, if you Google him, with the date Algiers 1969, his entire speech is available in English. So you can get that. I think that'd be very useful to check out. That was a very intentional thing to acknowledge the Panthers. Now, there was also a SNCC delegation that was there. So Kwame Ture, Stokely, Jimmy Garrett, Charlie Cobb, other people were there. But Eldridge Cleaver, who had been underground essentially, came out and announced himself as being based in Algiers. And there are several important books that have tried to sum that up. We were best represented by the Panthers, and we were also failed by the Panthers. In other words, there was that moment when we had an embassy. The Black Liberation Movement had an embassy, and we blew it, essentially.
The Panthers had an embassy. But to answer your question, why we weren't represented in the movie, did we have anything to do with the movie? The movie was put together by mainly indigenous people from the continent and indigenous people in Algiers. Only thing that you saw the major contribution was Archie Shepp at the end, playing saxophone. There was a lot more serious activity going on, and most certainly the other panels that were not officially a part of Nina Simone was there. The great Nina Simone was there. And you don't see her even mentioned at all in terms of the movie itself. But she had a lot to say. So, if you look at these conferences, these national and international conferences, even FESTAC, I think the value more than anything else is to show us the possibilities. Okay, now what's possible really depends upon, and I think that you're accurate, what was happening here in the States was just overlooked. Okay.
Stanislav Adoteve was invited to come to the United States a year after that festival in the founding of the African Heritage Studies Association, their meeting in Washington, D.C. So there was a recognition of his contribution. He was invited to come. And the plenary of the AHSA was C.L.R. James, Stanislav Adoteve, and myself, who spoke at Howard representing the global discussion. So there was always a connection, maybe not in the movie.
Well, that's what I was concerned about.
But the connection was there. Yeah.
Is that fine?
Any other questions? Yeah.
So they mentioned the Central African Republic in the movie. I didn't see Uganda or the Congo or Burundi. Was Central Africa not able to attend because of the strife at the time, or was it like purposely neglected? Do you know where those Central African countries are?
I mean, yeah, I believe Uganda, I definitely saw Chad, but, there are a lot of countries on the continent, so I don't know if they could have been there and not have been filmed, or, they may have been edited out of the final cut.
What's interesting about all of these festivals we've talked about, the only one that has a official archive is the one in 69. For example, in 77, Feshtak, they filmed everything. And the Nigerians have an archive that's sitting there, and all the film is degenerating. They haven't digitized it. So in most of these other festivals, there's no real archive. And that's something that we have to learn from. I'm glad that this has been taped, because that's the African history, that's the Pan-African history that is now in the hands of the few journalists that have written articles. That's what we had. And then we have the speeches that, of course, as I indicated, some of them are online. So.
Could you say a little bit about what happened to Ben Bella? You said he was in jail. That the president of Algeria during the festival had jailed Ben Bella, and I was interested in that because I know Ben Bella was one of the few leaders who was talking about marching on South Africa. Well, other people were talking about boycotting and so on and so forth. He was talking about getting together an army and going down and liberating South Africa. So I was just wondering, could you speak a little bit about what that was about in terms of him being imprisoned or what?
And we basically have 1 minute. Well, he was locked up, maltreated, and then he got out. So it wasn't one of those situations where he was killed.
Okay.
But that is the whole thing about national liberation struggles, is they were multi-class issues. There was the rural and the urban. There were all kinds of contradictions that were within the national liberation organizations, and then after independence, those contradictions tended to eliminate the level of unity that had previously existed. And unfortunately, we also have the question of religion and more secular thinking about how to transform society. So if you saw the film, you saw the traditional religious cultural manifestation of the Algerian people, particularly the role of women. And so you had to think, when the sisters came out and didn't have anything covering her breasts, what were those Algerian women who were, in an opposite way dressed? What were they thinking? What were the contradictions in any Pan-African setting?
But the other question is why it was necessary to even show all that. I mean, why was that in the film in the first place?
But even if they didn't show it, it was a reality. That is Africa. They were showing Africa.
There were very few women in the crowd. There were only men.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, the patriarchy in Africa still exists at a very high level. But in terms of focusing on a woman's breasts in the movie, that's not the main part of African culture.
One quick thing, in Haki, you mentioned, and thank you, both of you, for your insights of the experience of being there. I really appreciate that. I really learned a lot from both of you. More about you. I mean, known you for some years. But my point was, and you mentioned a symposium. Was there any symposium or panel discussion on the works of Fanon and the impact it may have had on liberation struggle?
Well, while I was there were not official panels on Fanon that I was aware of. There were always discussions, and we went to, they have a whole center inside of Algiers for Fanon. But I was not aware of any Fanon symposiums during the actual conference.